Well, good morning, everybody. This is Richard Chaplin from the Managing Partners Forum. Delighted to be here hosting the 14th episode of Sharing Management Business and Personal Challenges from the Pandemic. So what are we all about today? Let me just refresh our memory, as those who've seen the slide before forgive. What are the issues that the 750 or so registrants are actually raising? The optimal role in the multiple styles of leader and leadership team, the idea that one size fits all, not one that many people feel convincing. Making sure that people are safe, whether at home or in their office, once we go back to offices, not too many firms are at this stage. Thinking about your reputation, because some of the decisions you're taking are going to be quite tough. Try not to make mistakes along the way. Winning work from new clients to sustain the workforce. All firms will lose clients, particularly from bombed out sectors. So how are you actually going about winning the new work? Always very tough with social distancing. The whole area about productivity, morale, mental health, well-being, and I think a lot of what we're talking about today, which is the inclusive agenda. Planning assumptions and some of the alternative scenarios. You move out of firefighting. Now, what are you thinking about doing next? Thinking about your clients, are you serving them both locally and internationally? You may not be able to travel across frontiers. How are you staying in touch with those clients? Some of the financial metrics, the obvious ones, the billing WIP and collecting debtors, but what about solvency of your clients? Are you thinking about that? Because there's no point in doing work if you don't get paid for it. Thinking about your suppliers and the key contract clauses, as they always say, if you've got 25% margin, you save £1 on your suppliers. That's equivalent to £4 of new work. And yet one gets praise and the other gets almost ignored. Profit terms, no different. Cybersecurity has come and gone, but I don't think it's gone away. Phishing is much more active than it ever was. And then the last two, and these are the ones that I think are really important for everybody here. You must remember to ration your time to create the space for the real emergencies. It's very easy to be too busy doing things that aren't super important. If you're the leader of a firm, real emergencies will happen. Have the time and the headspace, get the sleep if necessary in order to deal with them. And picking up that point, getting everyone to realize that everyone needs some downtime, and that includes you. So those are the issues that our registrants have raised over the past few months. They've tweaked a bit as we go along, but I think it's pretty settled now. And I suspect we'll cover all of them in different ways, if not today, in future episodes. But that's the broad agenda that we're playing with. Again, I love this slide, so I'll just play it quickly, which is what are 7 strategies when facing a pandemic? And the first one is Lewis Carroll, believe in 6 impossible things before breakfast. Think big, in other words. Remember that if you are the power of your connections, but reciprocity is what actually fuels connections. So don't see it as running a vacuum cleaner. It doesn't work. But also think small. Think about the focus on the angles that resonate with your key audiences. Think about doing a series, not a one-off. And today's a perfect example. You're converting an audience into a community. Drop the convention. Go for the new ideas and services. But remember that while speed is of the essence, you've got to articulate and market test your assumptions. And if they prove invalid, amend them and then pivot in a new direction, which some of you will know as lean start is the term that's often applied to that particular philosophy. And then to be entrepreneurial and to keep listening and innovating. And the key word in that sentence is listening. If you're not listening, you're not innovating because you're not aware of what your clients need, and therefore you'll probably go off on a tangent somewhere with less than optimal results. And thank you to Elena Kutska of Globsec in Bratislava for that, because I thought that was a wonderful, wonderful way of looking at how one might actually cope with this particular situation. So who's on today's panel? Welcome back Francesca Lagerberg, who, as you will know, is the Global Lead Network Capabilities. The point person, I think I would call her. She's the one who absolutely knows everybody in the network and keeps them all working together in a positive way. Keep her being positive. Welcome David McQueen, who's an entrepreneur, professional speaker and a thought leader. And he is here very much to talk about the BLM movement, but I'm not trying to constrain him to that area, but I think he will have some really useful, important insights. And then Segun, who is the London managing partner of Brown Cave Leighton Paisner, which is a mid-sized to large law firm here in America. And he is the London managing partner and one of the few, I believe, managing partners from a BOEM background. So delighted you can join us today, sir. Subsequently, Professor Gareth Jones. If you haven't read, should anyone be led by you? I probably got that slightly wrong. Then do so. It's actually the most popular download from Harvard Business Review, having won a prize, 2001 I think it was. But anyway, fantastic. And Gareth is not just an academic, but has worked in both sides of the business and in academia, and has always got a really interesting observation. He was also actually at one point the HR director for the BBC, so very much the people agenda, as we all know. this whole pandemic is actually about the people, not the finances. That one has kind of sorted itself out with government help. And finally, but absolutely no means least on our core panel, Oliver Cummings, who is the COO of New Role, and also himself a millennial, and therefore bringing a slightly different perspective to some of our grey-haired chats possibly. And New Role, as you may be aware, is very much looking at how can you bring board level talent into the boardroom, and that's something a lot of managing partners often think about too when they're wondering what they might do after they've hung up their football boots. And of course, yours truly hosting as always. Now, what we now do is we go into a poll, if you recall, and just to remind you, for those who weren't on last week's poll, we were looking at some evidence for the House of Lords, and what came up? Well, first of all, 89% of the people on the call are currently exporting. They may not think of it exporting. Some of them said, oh, I didn't realize I was exporting when I ran a conference for running an event in for an organization in a different country, but it's exporting. And that, I think the industry average is 7%, to put the thing in context. So we as a sector are way 15 times more likely to be exporting than typical organizations. Government is aware of that, by the way. What are the things that are vital for success? Well, the things in the middle are interesting: staff mobility and commercial presence. Everything we're reading about the Brexit conversations at the moment suggests those two could be challenging. Are they, sorry, we've gone in the wrong direction there. Yeah, are they going, whoops. Yeah, thank you. So how important is recognition of professional qualifications? Well, prerequisite and essential is getting on for half, a little bit under. So that's a pretty significant numbers. How prepared are you for exporting once the transition period ends, which we believe to be in 6 months' time? One would have hoped that there weren't too many, and not at all, and somewhat doesn't look very encouraging. So again, this has all gone to government, as you appreciate. And the one that possibly most surprised the academics was the extent to which people under a WTO option felt they'd be, I'm all right, Jack, you know, no reduction, even in 1 year, or in the red, it's a sort of 3-year dip. You know, these are people who perhaps haven't looked into exactly what would WTO rules mean for services businesses. And we talked about this at the Government Council a couple of days ago. There's definitely need for some education there. I think it's the only word I would use. So that was the feedback from last week. What was quite interesting here was this quote, and I appreciate you probably won't have time to read it all, but basically saying, somebody said, oh, actually I found this really important. And I think that's really possibly where this program actually helps, because it isn't about asking people what are your needs, it's about exploring issues and people then thinking, oh, I didn't realize I had a need there, and then going away and doing something about it. And if we as in this show can continue to do that, and hopefully we'll do that today with some of the key topics we're covering, I think we're really adding a lot of value, and that's why government says your results are so incredibly valuable in our analysis, and that's a quote directly from government. So as well as the fantastic panel, we're also helping inform government on exactly what's going on from the mid-market, which is probably the most hardest part of the spectrum for them to access. So let's do today's poll. Now, today's poll is about inclusiveness, and some of you may think I'm doing a BLM poll, and I think that's true at one level, but actually there is an agenda called inclusiveness, and I'm not using the word diversity. I hope you noticed that. I think diversity is about separation, inclusiveness is about coming together, and I think the whole agenda for me is about inclusiveness. So how would people describe the current level of inclusiveness? The most popular is a 4 out of 5, where 5 is high. We've got 5% who are down at 1, but they look like being the outliers. Managing partners, primary responsibility for the inclusive agenda, that's 45% of you, then a board member, and no one is still 10%, which is, you know, not a meaningless number. How often is it discussed at management meetings? Regularly is 60%, so that's fairly clear. To what extent are ideas that work adopted? Again, 2/3 say normally. And similarly, but not quite a high percentage in terms of ideas that don't work dropped. The sometimes is a bit stronger there. We're then looking into the whole issue of targets, and again, you're obviously seeing all of this of all, but number of clients, only 10% saying that they would be tracking the number of clients from both backgrounds. Number of employees, that's 60%, and that's probably more likely. In terms of visiting unis, a third are going to lots of different unis, which typically helps with that agenda. How many people are spoken to at the university open days? That's not a stat. Nobody's collecting that stat. People from speak at meetings, again, 7%. people interview for stretch promotions, 10%, employees assigned to special projects, 10%, employees on committee chairs, 7%, number of employees considered for BAME leadership programs, 18, and on leadership programs, 23. But I think the ones in the middle, and again, I'm sure that Segun will have some views on that, but there's clearly in the middle processing area, rather than when you get to the leadership potential space, there is work that could be done with less than 10% of you saying that this is happening. And that's why it was an anonymous poll, because I know these aren't necessarily stats that people will be totally proud of. No, never 77% in terms of rewards for achieving them, and 82% no sanctions if they're not achieved. And equally, and this may be a bit depressing for some, even if your senior management and partners are not being inclusive, 34% no sanction, and only less than about 15% consistently. So, and in terms of, and this may be influencing to David, how to what extent is the firm influenced by movements such as BLM? 50% it's a sometimes. So therein lies, I think, a whole bundle of data which we didn't have before from those on today's call. So at which happy point I will stop sharing. I will pass over to Francesca, who's going to start with her thoughts for the week.
Thank you, Richard. As always, fascinating poll today. Really, really interesting. And I sometimes think you might have a little sneaky look at my diary each week, Richard, because there's the 3 themes for today, all have featured in various ways during my current week. So let me start with inclusivity. Everyday inclusivity, I think, is a lovely way of thinking about this. Not about a moment in time, but what do you do every day? What real action are you taking to make a difference? And the extraordinary things that we've seen over the last couple of weeks, highlighting issues that clearly need to be addressed by society, have shown, put into sharp light, things that have been around for a long time but have never been properly resolved. So I'm really looking forward to listening to David later on today around that. One of the pieces that have really struck me is it's very easy to make statements and put out press releases and stick something on Twitter, but what are people really doing to make a real change? What action is really happening? What are people actually for as opposed to what they're just against? And what is CEO activism in times like this? How do you make that come alive? How do you really make sure it's not just something that sits on a shelf, like many programs can sit on a shelf, but is something that's really real? Just in line with that, we've got a fantastic range of individuals sitting in the firm who've really done something that I think is hugely important, because often they're not sitting at the top table, but they've made their voice heard. There's one particular individual I'd just like to shout out called Vincent Ingula, and he's just been named in the Empower Ethnic Minority Role Model list for 2020. And he came along, and imagine he's quite a junior member of staff in terms of years, but hugely thoughtful, articulate, and he spoke to all of the UK partners. Very powerful, very thoughtful, very calm, really good at educating, because I think that's one of the things that, if you're like me, you're white and you're middle class, education feels hugely important in this particular issue. So what he does, and what the people that I think has been most powerful in movements around inclusivity, is reverse mentoring. Educating yourself, learning, seeing what the real issue is, and going beyond the surface area and really trying to understand, so what you do really makes a positive difference. So that's been a huge part, I think, of the last couple of weeks, getting educated about issues properly and then doing something about it. Then just to wrap the other 2 core themes of today, how the business world's going to change. And I know none of us know, but we can make some good educated guesses. And what does that mean, particularly for C-suite talent? Another issue that's really taking, I think, all of us a lot of our time, as it should, because this is about how you show up today and what you're expecting for the future. Because if you're not showing up today very well, you're going to really struggle in the next few years. So being sure that we're treating our talent right, we're doing the right things today, and we take the learning of the last couple of months into the future. And 2 things have really stood out for me. The people who have done extremely well in a crisis usually have some very core competencies that absolutely shine. We talk a lot about the good old VUCA world, being able to deal with volatility and complexity and ambiguity. But in a crisis, they have been just extraordinarily good. And I think we've all got people in our teams that we've seen really come forward and shown an attitude and aptitude to deal with that. And the world is getting more volatile. So I think that's a hugely valuable part of it. And the second piece, I think, is a willingness to help out, because in times of swift moving activity, and I see this at board level, you can't just plod along as you always have. You have to think about agility, being willing to muck in on areas that perhaps aren't your core, but be thoughtful, be calm, but also be able to see that the world is moving at a pace that we never thought was possible, and you have to be able to cope with that, and sometimes be willing to make a decision even when you haven't got all the facts at your fingertips. So Richard, that's the things I've been looking at the last couple of weeks, and looking forward to hearing everybody else.
Oh, thanks very much, Francesca. Always positive. I loved your example of the young man being asked to present to all the partners. It's a very scary thing to do, a bit like William Hague, I think, at the Conservative Party conference all those years ago. Very precocious, but none the better for that. David, can I introduce you now? As I said, a professional speaker and thought leader, accountancy, and IT background, and saw the light because you found that you were explaining complex ideas to people in a way that they could relate to, and from that a whole new career has developed. And obviously you're going to come and brief us a bit about the movement and how you see it, and have also been quite active in LinkedIn on the matter, as some of you others on the call may be aware. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Richard. So as a professional speaker, I know I've got 5 minutes, so I'm going to put my timer so I can finish before the 5 minutes is over. Very quick background is that I do a lot of work around leadership communication with a number of C-suite and middle leaders across various industries. And one of the key programs that I've been doing over the last couple of years has been specifically around a concept that I call culture add. So where employees and organizations are recognizing through their whole talent management pipeline that they hire for culture add and not for culture fit. Because often when they have hire for culture fit, that's when they have a lot of blind spots. And what's been happening with me over the last a few weeks or so is obviously because this whole concept around Black Lives Matter has raised its head. The impact it's had on a lot of organizations is that they've had to take a minute, because a lot of Black employees have been able to raise a lot of issues that have affected them, which have been traditionally parked in terms of other priorities that the business may have. And so for the last 2 weeks online, obviously, and currently booked up until August, there are a lot of organizations that have asked me to come on board because they're very scared and they're very fearful about having this conversation around race and ethnicity at work, because they're afraid of saying the wrong thing. And for me, I know this is in a really emotional time for people, but I've developed this really simple framework that I share with individuals, and I love to share with the audience here for anybody to be able to take away. I call it the 4L framework. Basically, a lot of people are coming from a point of fear. So the opposite of fear is love. So how do we create a space of love where you love yourself enough to be able to speak your truth, where you encourage other people to be able to speak as well? The second one is about language. Now, what are the terms that we use? The terms have been bandied around about white privilege and about things like diversity and inclusion. What do these things actually mean to people when they're having a conversation? Can we make sure that when we're talking, we're not talking at cross purposes so people understand that language? The third one is about listening. So how do we make sure that senior leaders, middle leaders, and all people in the staff are listening, not only actively, but they're asking effective questions in order to be able to move it forward? And then the fourth one is about leverage. Now we know where we're coming from. We've used the right language and we've listened. How do we leverage this using a really good business case and tying it back into our purpose, our vision, and our mission? How do we make sure that this difficult conversation is part of our overall strategy? How we make people feel they have a sense of belonging? The second part that has come out of this is the identification of a talent pipeline. So I'm working with one of the Magic Circle firms at the moment, where we're talking about how do we increase the presence of more Black professionals being able to go through associate and eventually into partner level. And the learning we're getting from that. And obviously last week there was a big report that came out about a lot of the Magic Circle firms not having any Black partners at all. And people are starting to ask questions, and a lot of that's coming through to my inbox. A lot of that is being able to speak to senior leaders and people in recruitment and people across the whole chain as to how do you recruit? Where do you recruit from? What are the mentoring programs you have in place? What are the coaching programs you have in place? The leadership, the sponsorship. What are all these things we have as a general whole, and how can a general in the organization? And how can you make sure that at this point in time, when so much energy is being focused around the plight of Black professionals, how can you use that to learn, not just for Black professionals, but for all ethnicities and for all of those marginalized or underrepresented groups in the organization that can learn from that? And then the last point that I want to raise, so I can finish early, is about the wider conversation. How does that affect the supply chain? How does it affect the way that you do mentoring programs or you recruit from universities, and making sure that you're not just restricting it to a similar or a very restricted and small line of individuals that can come into the organization? Because yes, this is a pivotal time, and Black Lives Matter has awakened a lot of conversations that a lot of people are uncomfortable with. But I'm of the belief that wherever you are, if you're a leader, you should be happy and okay with uncomfortable conversations. And if it means an outside facilitator like myself coming in to be able to shift that forward, by all means, let's learn the lesson now. Let's make sure we share that knowledge, and let's make sure that we move forward, making sure that whenever you are in an organization, you feel that you have a sense of belonging and that you align with the values for the company that says, you know, we want you here and we will go out of our way to make you feel welcome. So those are my insights with 40 seconds left. I made sure I did it quicker than I said. My insights on being able to move and work with a lot of organizations around the Black Lives Matter movement. But the wider input is how can we make our culture stronger in each and every one of our organizations?
And I mean, one of the points from the poll was that leadership is that the managing partner is the one who, if you like, owns the inclusiveness agenda. But when we then came to drill down, we found that in some of the things that possibly the way that leadership might be rolled out, people were not scoring very highly in the poll. So I'd like to now perhaps turn to Segun, who, as I mentioned before, is the London managing partner of a mid-size, 250 million law firm, part here, part in the US, recent merger. And I think I'm correct in saying it's one of the few you were talking there about Black partners. Well, Segun is clearly not just partner, but partner among equals, as he's now raised to being the managing partner, and therefore has, if you like, himself the agenda to move forward with. So I'd be fascinated to hear how you reflect on both the poll and also David's thoughts. Over to you, Segun.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you very much for inviting me to this forum. I am a regular attendee, so it's a particular pleasure to be on this side of the camera. I was actually tickled by what Richard said about using inclusivity or inclusiveness as opposed to diversity. And one of the sayings that always comes to mind when I'm thinking about that is, it's often said that diversity is being invited to the dance, and inclusion is actually being asked to dance. So it goes to your point that inclusivity is actually the main thing, which is a feeling of belonging. Now, the poll is interesting, and a number of things in there which I think are revealing the way firms structure and approach inclusiveness and inclusivity. And I think that what it tells me really is that the tone needs to be set at the top. And I was pleased to see that a number of organizations identify the managing partner or board member as being responsible for inclusiveness. That to me is key. The tone needs to be set at the top. It needs to be authentic. It needs to be approached in a methodical but big-hearted way. And that tone comes from having a managing partner, a co-chair or a chair, or a senior board member being identified as responsible for the inclusiveness agenda. At BCLP, you will know that two of our inaugural co-chairs were women. We were one of the very few law firms, global law firms, to have two women at the top. Now, that wasn't a design. It was simply they were the two who conceived the merger and made it happen. So for us, it's always been absolutely key to recognize that the broader the talent pool you have, the more likely you will have good ideas to take forward. And that has filtered through to ensuring that I, as a managing partner, again, not because I'm Black, but I am a Black solicitor who can see and can have different perspectives. So I think having the tone set at the top is absolutely key, because people will take their cue from that. Secondly is a recognition that diversity and inclusivity is not just a moral imperative. It's not just ethically the right thing to do, but it's actually good business sense. And I think that there is often a club of people in the firm who throw their hands up in the air and roll their eyes and say, oh, here comes the diversity agenda again. We're not a charity, we're not a social experiment. Quite frankly, I have no truck with people with that attitude, and I tell them that you are a dinosaur and you don't get it. Our clients are looking to us for leadership and to reflect to the values which they hold dear. And if we can't get with that program, then we're not going to be a sustainable business. Inclusiveness is about building a sustainable organization. And if you exclude large amounts of talent pool, you will fail. That's my own clear answer to those naysayers. I think the last thing you need to have is, as well as a tone being set, is a clear program of initiatives which result in action. I think we've all talked about messages and press statements and good words being put out there, but our people know if we are walking the walk as well as talking the talk. So just simply saying I support Black Lives Matter is not enough. You need to show that in action. It needs to be reflected in action to recruit, to retain, and to promote talent. It needs to be an action, initiatives that show that you value people being themselves at work, whether it's talking about their experiences, is developing empathy for others, whether it's having a recruitment program that actually goes to where you will pick the most diverse talent. Words needs to be put into action, and people notice if you don't. Now, I know that my 5 minutes is coming up, and I probably won't finish ahead of as much as David managed to, but I think I'll leave it there, and I hope that I've said a few words that give people a notion of what it is to put words into action. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Segun, and I'm sure we'll be picking up some of those points in the panel session later. Gareth, over to you. Gareth is someone you maybe know, wrote the, I think, arguably the most popular article ever published in our Business Review, Why Should Anyone Want to Be Led by You? Very much coming at it from a people perspective. And I think what I've heard so far just on today's show is the importance of the people agenda and the management, the flat management, the processes, the coaching, leadership, all those elements which are absolutely essential if things are indeed to change. Gareth, over to you, sir. Please unmute your mic, as I say, before you go live. That'd be great.
Good morning, and Richard, thank you very much for inviting me too. It's always good to have someone miserable on the panel, I think. And by the way, the challenge of saying anything useful in 5 minutes is enormous for me. It normally takes me about 12 hours to get warmed up, but I'm going to do my best. And David has set a storming standard, so it's going to be hard. I've been thinking about leadership in a changing world, but since I have a slightly perverse brain, when things change, it always prompts in my mind this question: what stays the same? Because not everything can change at the same time. That would defy the laws of physics. So what's going to stay the same as a key leadership attribute is what I have called before situation sensing, the ability to collect soft data. Though to call it soft, of course, is a misnomer because it's the hardest data you ever collect. The ability to be able to walk into the marketing department and say, it's flying in here, it's great, what's going on, it's fantastic. The ability to walk into compliance and say, it's flat, what's happening. That ability to use an old English idiom, to smell the gravy, to understand what's going on in ways that the management information system doesn't tell you. I think situation sensing remains a critical leadership skill, and some leaders in professional services firms are really good at it. Some need to put it in their diary. Now, in COVID pandemic, it's hard to walk around. In fact, I woke up this morning thinking, why are we Zooming? Why are we on a conference call? Well, we're Zooming because we're looking at each other's faces, and I'm looking at Francesca's study and her houseplants, and whether Segun has organized the books in order to impress us or whatever, I don't know. But we're gaining some sort of data, but of course it's not the same as having a coffee together or walking around the park. When I was at London Business School, I often used to say I did most of my best work in the park, walking around the park. And I think that activity, that leadership skill, unplanned time. See, on a Zoom call, there's an agenda. Well, especially with clever people, and professional services firms are in the main full of clever people. It's not what they say, it's what they don't say that matters. Or as Thelonious Monk marvelously puts it, don't listen to the notes I play, listen to the ones I don't. So my first thought is, in these very difficult times, don't forget the role of situation sensing. The second one has already been touched on, I think, both by David and Francesca and Segun, is about leaders revealing their humanity. And by the way, that might also mean revealing their weaknesses. There is still a dreadful tendency in all kinds of organizations for leaders to think they need to be perfect. Well, good luck with that. You'll fail. You'll fail. So when you reveal your weaknesses, you humanize yourself. So situation sensing, something that came out in Richard's opening slides, by the way, adapting to context. Authenticity, I think Segun used the word authenticity. One of the big misunderstandings about authenticity is it's about being the same all the time. Well, that's wrong. You don't treat your partner the same way as you treat your tennis partner. We play different roles, and when we play different roles, we have to adapt our behavior. The real test is there some degree of consistency in our role performances? That's what makes us authentic. And indeed, as Segun said, a connection between what we say and what we do. So that's a really important test of authenticity. Final thought. It comes from the work of a sociologist called George Simmel, writing in the early decades of the 20th century. And he wrote quite a lot about societies under conditions of siege. And I think the pandemic is a kind of siege. And here's the good news. Under conditions of siege, we cohere. We pull together. In his phrase, we get increases in estimations of social honor. So we pull together. That's the good news. Here's the bad news. It doesn't last forever. Things fall apart. So last gloomy thought, in our firms and in our societies, we have a huge healing process. As things stand, we're divided between young and old, immune and vulnerable, rich and poor, employed and unemployed, and if we're not careful, black and white. We need a healing process in order to maintain societal cohesion as the pressure of the pandemic weakens. That's the end of my 5 minutes.
Wow, amazing. Thank you so much, Gareth. That's great. Oliver, I think a lot of what we're hearing today is about leadership. And as we all know, a leader without a strong board is also often going to fail. So if you can come and sort of share a little bit about where you see the board selection, the way that society is actually currently bringing together those with board roles, and how possibly in some of the new technologies and the rest may be able to help that process. That would be really great. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Thinking ahead of today about what would be most interesting for this audience, it struck me most of you likely wear two hats. One as an organizational leader with your own board, the other as an individual with value to contribute as a board member for external organizations. So I've divided my observations on trends into two to reflect those two slightly different perspectives. Probably important to caveat with, especially with the academics on the call, that the trends I've picked out are based on what we see through the New Role platform rather than an academic analysis of the market. But with over 1,000 board roles going through the New Role platform the last couple of years across all sectors, size and types of organizations, from startups to multinationals and everything in between, including non-profits and governments, which I think makes us the largest player in the space by some distance. We're probably a good bellwether for what's happening in the broader market, despite being the disruptor. So if I start with the organization perspective trends, the first one I pick out is around a pause. There's been a pause in board hiring, but it's very much a sense of deferral rather than cancellation. Seasoned chairs are generally sanguine, seeing through the storm, but right now very much focused on survival. Boards are asking directors to defer rotation off to navigate through the crisis with an experienced set of hands. Interestingly, it's been the growth and VC investors who've been most cautious. PLCs remain under regulatory constraints, continuing to hire, albeit more cost sensitively. Non-profits are more in need than ever, and government really varies by department. It does actually, interestingly, make it a good time to be hiring for those organizations adopting that mantra of be greedy when others are fearful, because we're seeing more overhires with the supply of roles reduced. Second trend I pick out on the organization side is this continued pressure to recruit inclusively, but organizations are facing ongoing challenges navigating it. So non-profits and government have been leaders on this, but they struggle to access the talent through their own channels. PLC boards have had gender diversity as a key focus for a while, but until recently, there's only really been lip service to the ethnicity. But there's a real sense that that is changing with Black Lives Matter recently. PEVC, the private sector, it's still mainly lip service. And I think until LPs put their foot down as they did in public markets, I can't see that changing. There's an ongoing challenge that even when boards take the active step to recruit for diversity, then having to navigate a legal tightrope, and then lacking the know-how on how to assess candidates who are different and struggle to deal with that knee-jerk, but they're not like me reaction. The data we have suggests there is bias at work. Third trend, there are several key skills which are in particular demand. So digital, fundraising and finance, and marketing. On digital especially, organizations are digging deeper and wider to find fresh talent. We just had a FTSE 100 use the platform to recruit a board member 3 levels below, C-suite for a digital thinker. We're also seeing, interestingly, a rising number of younger candidates enjoying success as boards, so people in their 30s, who offer a perspective that the boards don't have with an average age of 60, which is a problem when a substantial portion of their employees, customers, suppliers, and stakeholders are millennials who rent and don't buy, amongst other things. There's a growing, fourth trend, growing comfort with remote hiring. Indeed, a growing sense of the benefits. Interviewers and interviewees are preparing better. They're being more economic with their time, and boards are becoming more data-driven in their assessments. We're seeing more psychometrics and other tests. It's an area we're definitely spending a lot of time focusing on. And the final trend in the organization side is the rise of what we call the board advisory, pop-up board, and subcommittees. We're seeing a growing awareness of the benefits of board roles as a low-cost way to access talent without having to implement formal structures and responsibilities of the board. This actually started in the pro bono space, where charities would appoint one person to the board, but rather than discard 5 or 6 other high-quality candidates who had volunteered to work pro bono and demonstrate a passion for their cause, they're finding ways to make use of that talent. And then very quickly, perspectives, trends from the candidate perspective, we're seeing more first-time NEDs as the trend towards the gig economy and flexible working grows. We're seeing a continued imbalance of supply versus demand driving competition for seats, raising the bar and professionalizing the role. We sometimes hear from people who say they had more luck getting roles through their own network, and when you look at their profile, you understand why, and you tell them keep going for as long as you can, because once those boards start running proper processes, you're just not going to get the roles. We're seeing a growing demand for purpose-driven roles, so people shifting from commercial to non-profit and social impact organizations as part of second and third careers. We're seeing a growing understanding of the learning and development benefits a board role can have for an executive. So actually, we're seeing more and more boards approaching us, organizations asking us to help them get their next-gen talent a board seat because of what they're learning from that and taking proactive steps. And then finally, we continue to see that on average, women and people of color continue to undersell themselves, while on average, men continue to believe they can do everything and struggle to believe there could be anyone better than them. There is a clear trend at work, which means if you are from an underrepresented group, it's a good time to be going for board roles. If you're not, it's only getting tougher. So that covers it. I hope that was helpful, and happy to take any questions either on the call or later.
Fantastic. Well, we've got about 10 minutes or so, perhaps a couple more. Francesca, would you like to bring you back into the start of the panel session now, and just any thoughts that you've heard today that kind of particularly were interesting or insightful for you?
Well, I've been scribbling on lots of bits of post-it notes about all the different things coming through. And maybe I'll pick up one of the questions that's come in on the chat. And I love it when people post Q&A because we can make sure we're answering the things that you find most interesting. But Walter's put a point on there saying this pandemic has shown how much flat hierarchies and coaching leadership matters. And I think that speaks to a couple of things we've talked about today, is that sort of very old style command and control, which, you know, sort of back in the 1950s or 1850s, how little that has worked well in the current environment. Small agile groups. I think it speaks to the inclusivity point as well. You're far more likely to get that interactivity when you've got a slightly flatter hierarchy. But the other thing that really stood out for me is being willing to have uncomfortable conversations. And I think there's a huge piece there around the fact that some of the things that perhaps we leave until end of year performance reviews, the dreaded performance review, or we kind of push off into the distance, those are the conversations that having them in a timely way is so much more impactful, and not ducking them, you know, having that conversation, opening yourself up to it. And I think the pandemic gives you a good opportunity to rethink how you have those conversations as well.
Segun, you kind of were the one, I think, who raised this whole point about particularly looking at the process, and rather than just putting up some Twitter statement or something saying we're in favour, but how it actually translates into practical steps. Did you hear anything particularly coming from the board side that encouraged you or discouraged you? Would you look at some of your young lawyers taking on these type of voluntary roles, for example?
Yes, I think that the point Oliver made about diverse people and people of color underselling themselves is one which actually did resonate with me. And I think that there is still so much more that can be done to mentor, to sponsor, to advocate for diverse employees. I think that what we hear time and again is a sense that again, it's that sense of disconnection, that do I really belong here, and am I capable of adding value? So I think that part of any inclusiveness agenda has got to be a focus on giving people permission and empowering them to. I know it's a hackneyed phrase, be themselves at work or bring their whole selves to work, but it's so important. And it goes to Francesca's point, and others have made it, about having difficult, uncomfortable conversations. I think that when junior members of staff see leaders being vulnerable and admitting that actually I find it tough, I have to come into work and put my game face on because I'm sitting in a room where no one looks at me, looks like me. When junior members of staff hear leaders saying that, it does give them permission also to say, you know what, I feel the same way. And that starts the dialogue, because I think it's all about empathetic conversations and seeing the world through other people's eyes. And I think if this Black Lives Matter movement has taught it anything, it is that. But there's so much going on. We're all swimming in this sea of unconsciousness where some people see the difficulties that others don't. So the more we can bring people who don't see it to see it through people's eyes of those who do, the more change and the more lasting change there will be.
There's a question from Mike to Oliver, but before then, I'd like to ask Gareth, who I know has strong views around, I won't say showing weaknesses, but sort of being honest in conversations, but as I put it, with skill. Do you just want to kind of explain a bit about that leadership? Because I'm hearing so much on the call today about the importance of leadership, and we've obviously just heard from Segun, who is such a leader, if I may.
Well, I just, again, I want to begin with a gloomy thought, by the way. Becoming managing partner doesn't make you a leader. Leadership is given to you by followers. It's not given to you by a job title. And sadly, in my experience at professional services firms, many people who have leadership titles are not leaders at all. And in fact, great organizations build leadership all over the place. It's not to say everyone can be a leader, because not everyone wants to be. But so leadership's basically a non-hierarchical concept. second thought, Richard, just to pick up on the point you've made, having tough conversations involves another social skill, which is called the use of social distance. That's the ability to get close in order to find out what's really going on, and the ability to get distant, often to manage performance conversations. Part of our culture, especially in professional services firms, is we don't like to get close because it involves revealing ourselves. And we don't like to get distant because it damages relationships. So we kind of hover halfway, which is a rotten place to be. And really effective leaders do both. They get close in order to create belonging, all of the things that actually people have talked about today, that sense of belonging. But they're able to get distant in order to have very frank conversations. And that's a real difficult skill. The good news about it is that it can be learned. It can be learned. You can learn how to do it. So my sort of thoughts about, I mean, by the way, I have found the panel extremely interesting. I hope the people on the call have too. And I've learned a great deal. So I think that's really useful. On the diversity and inclusiveness agenda, I'm inclined to go back to one of my favorite ever political slogans. And maybe the panel will know where it comes from. The struggle continues, victory is inevitable. It comes from perhaps the greatest change organization of the 20th century, the African National Congress. But it's often tattooed inside my head. So certainly when I was at the BBC, where change seemed so difficult, you had to wake up in the morning and say, the struggle continues, victory is inevitable. And I kind of feel that about the diversity and inclusion agenda. We just got to keep going and keep doing stuff because for the reasons that Segun mentions, this isn't a moral imperative, it's a business imperative. Well, it's both, actually. It's both a moral and a business imperative.
Thank you very much, Gareth. That's really great. David, you're perhaps amongst us the one who's most likely to go out there and be the thought leader and kind of stir things, as well as obviously doing great work with your clients. But, you know, what sort of campaigning ideas have you been taking away from today's call?
So I think one of the ones that really jumped out for me was from the data from Oliver. So being a tech head, I'm a real data, and the stuff I was scribbling like mad when he was given the sense of what is in demand and what a lot of people are looking for. And a lot of the work that I do specifically around that leadership coaching or performance guidance pieces is getting people to think slightly wider, but making sure it's informed by data. So I'll give you a quick example. I remember in 2017 and 19, McKinsey released 2 reports around why diversity matters and diversity matters. And in both of those, they showed how across 1,017, I believe, companies, they were able to demonstrate how having racial ethnicity on your leadership team, on your senior boards, would give you 35% performance, EBITDA performance across the actual industry was actually better. But a lot of people still push back on that because they don't know how. And for me, it's one of the key points that Oliver was speaking about was about the non-executive directors. So how do we make sure that leaders are aware of pulling in those individuals as non-executive directors and making sure that they can get a flavor of what it looks like to be part and parcel of that organization. And the second thing that really just jumped out for me as well was, and I was kind of like screaming because I wanted to say yes, was when Gareth was talking about situation sensing, because there's so many people who just don't understand that. They're just so focused on the bottom line, which is incredibly important, but often what they're focused on is the outcome rather than the system that actually creates the outcome. And that situation sensing piece for me really hit me right in the soul. And I, with all credit to Gareth, I will be quoting that going forward to a number of leaders when I speak to them in the future as well. So thank you.
And read some of his articles too, would be my suggestion.
I have already.
They're fantastic. Oliver, we seem to be, again, lots of people have really been commenting, I think, with huge interest on that information. I know from seeing your role that you do some fantastic videos, you do a certain amount of thought leadership yourself around this agenda. I mean, is there some way we can work together to actually try and pick up some of those gaps that you've identified in the people who perhaps aren't putting themselves forward in a way that absolutely makes this, complements the BLM movement? I think it's broader than BLM personally.
Sure. I mean, we're working on a number of initiatives ourselves. Actually, we just started a partnership with an organisation training young women of colour, equipping them to sit on their first board seat. And there are various other things we've been doing, but we'd like to sort of think more about how we can do that. Just picking up on the question that came in, I think interestingly, professional service firms, I would say, under-index with us. And I'm not sure if that's because we haven't particularly targeted them, or that represents an inherent sort of conservativeness. You know, we've tended to follow where the traction has been fastest. I mean, in my own experience, professional service firms do tend to be quite conservative, but there's a real range, and it depends on the quality of organisation. So some of our earliest adopters, I would say, are some of the sort of the leading professional service firms who figured out various things. So you know, one of them was that, you know, by getting their alum and their sort of partners into board roles, it sort of feeds back into their organizations, and they've been very proactive in partnering with us and how they go about that. In terms of the question on sort of what will stay versus change, you know, I think boards will continue to be primarily about the value that they can add. Good boards, it's about the value they add. I think what will change will be where that value comes from as organizations get better about digging deeper and wider. And sort of picks up on a couple of points made earlier there, where I'd say you get two different sorts of organizations. There are those who sort of will come to you and say, we need to fill our sort of diversity quota. We need to tick the box, or our inclusivity quota. And then there are those who are looking for the best person and will search far and wide for it. And they'll end up with diversity because that sort of talent will be diversely distributed. And I think that's where, in my mind at least, how I unpick that sort of cause and correlation thing of why do diverse firms sort of outperform. I mean, it's very difficult to do an A/B test on this, but in my view, it's because those firms are casting far and wide for the very best talent, and therefore diversity is a byproduct of that process, rather than those who try to reverse engineer it.
Thank you very much. Gosh, we're nearly at time. It's been a fascinating panel. I've had lots of people sending comments into us saying how much they have found this incredibly valuable. So what I'll do now, if I may, is I'll just kind of go through the out. So just to say that we're now week 14, as I mentioned, but all the previous weeks, the videos are now available on Management Library. Everybody on the show and all the 750 people who signed up are all open to go and look at those videos and hopefully take away some inspiration. I've certainly taken away a lot of inspiration from today. Again, it's quite nice. I love it when people kind of just send me unprompted feedback. This is one that literally came in a couple of days ago from a managing partner. Says they're a very good check and balance of what best practice looks like in the strange world we find ourselves in. Now, what was interesting to me from today is I don't think there was very much today curiously about the pandemic. I think most of the issues that we were talking about were ones that are kind of were around. I think what the pandemic has done is shone a spotlight on some of the areas which possibly really need attention. But having been running the Managing Partners Forum for the best part of 30 years, I think we could have had a session 10 years ago and many of these same topics might well have come up. And maybe that's a sad thing to say, because of course we would hope that we would have brought about change, but you know, maybe like communism being the perfect political system, no one's quite worked out how to get there. At least that's my sense. So thank you all again, panel, and hope everybody today found today's session valuable and useful. Please share the word. These are public goods. It's a public good service we're offering. We really do want, you know, lots of people to come in. We're up to 18 countries at the moment, and that includes places like Dominican Republic and Nigeria. So this is not just your obvious suspects around Europe, and that's great. And I think the main point to me remains that the way we help ourselves is by sharing, but not in a way that becomes groupthink. And that's why it was so valuable today to hear from some fantastic experts. And thank you all for your contribution, because I think that way, that combination of hearing from the experts and then sharing is what actually will take us to a better place. But maybe I'm not as pessimistic as Gareth, but yeah, you're right. Unfortunately, things will go back to normal at some point, whatever new normal looks like. On which note, thank you again, and we'll be back next Friday with another interesting panel. And thank you for being a great panel today. And if you are interested in learning more about the forum, there's a link here. We'd love to hear from you. Otherwise, bye for now.